He had a mop in his hands and a promise on his lips. The courtroom went quiet, the kind of silence that makes people lean forward even if they don't know why. Morning light slanted through tall windows and picked out dust motes that had nothing to do with the moment, until the mop handle, knuckled and scarred, caught the glint and became a kind of banner. Elliot Warren looked smaller than the men in tailored suits at the front benches, but there was a steadiness to him that had nothing to do with clothing. He planted the mop against the floor, straightened his back, and said, without rhetorical flourish, "I will defend her." You could feel the scene tighten like a turned key. Cameras on the press benches swiveled. The judge, polite but measured, paused mid-sentence. Prosecutor Catherine Morris, a woman with the practiced calm of someone used to being heard, gave a slow blink, as if to reset expectations. At the defense table, where a high-paid firm's chairs were conspicuously empty, Ariana Lockhart sat as if suspended. Beautiful, taut, wild-eyed, beneath the calm coat of a woman whose fortune and reputation had been stripped down to a single chair and the sound of her own breath. Elliot's voice carried. It wasn't theatrical. It was a man speaking in the register he'd once known well. Legal cadence, moral clarity. "I am a licensed attorney," he told the room. "I will represent Ms. Lockhart pro bono." He reached into his jacket and produced a laminated, creased bar card, soiled at the edges, the plastic softened by years of being in a wallet that had seen better days. The card had a name that for him was a map of another life: Warren and Associates, New York State Bar. For the spectators, it read like a plot wrinkle nobody expected. For Ariana, it was an odd, personal gift from a stranger who refused to let the world swallow her quietly. The image of the mop lingered. When cameras later ran the footage, commentators didn't talk about dust. They talked about a promise. In a city where suits often spoke louder than people, he had chosen a mop and a vow. It was a small, irreverent rebellion against the assumption that dignity came priced in fabric. If this is resonating, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe anyone can stand up for what's right, tap like and stay with the story. Before Elliot's voice could be reduced to viral sound bites, the camera found his hands. Long fingers, small scars across the knuckles from a life that had not been afraid of work. People noticed the way he kept them folded over the mop, as if steadying himself against more than just the weight of a shift he'd finished at 4 in the morning. There was the echo of movement, sweeps in his life repeated in physical rhythm, one hand pushing forward, the other steady at the base. The mop was more than a prop. It was a record. He had once argued before judges like these. He had once been the kind of man the legal world expected: sharp suits, a tidy haircut, an office that smelled faintly of leather and coffee. There was a photograph, in an old box at the bottom of a trunk, of him smiling on a promotion day with his wife, Sarah, arms around each other, expensive ribbon at the corner of the print. Sarah had been the patient strength behind him, the voice that steadied, and the warmth against which he measured the coldness of deals. She was gone now. 3 winters, hospital corridors, a misdiagnosed condition that money couldn't fix. Things unspooled after that. A corporate takedown, a phone call he thought was a betrayal, a firm he trusted that turned on him when pressure mounted. The record said the firm's partner in charge had been distracted. The public record called it negligence. Elliot called it exile. Janitor was the label that fit after the firm folded him into redundancy, and legal budgets made him redundant. He cleaned the buildings that used to be his courtrooms. He swept the corners where other men had tossed files. He polished the brass of handles he had once opened as an admitted member of the bar. The badge in his wallet allowed him to sign emergency filings. It didn't pay for Mia's tuition or for rent. But it still had power. That day, in that courtroom, power came not from an office, but from recognition of what the law could look like when wielded by someone who understood both its edges and its failures. Ariana Lockhart's trouble began with genius and perfect timing. She'd co-founded a small lab in Brooklyn 10 years earlier, a scattershot band of physicists and coders whose obsession with quantum stability had finally produced, on a Stormside night 2 summers ago, a prototype processor that promised to reshape data encryption and energy distribution. Headlines called it a leap forward. Investors called it the future. Nexus Innovations, under the leadership of Gregory Vance, sensed threat where Ariana saw possibility. Nexus's board left no leak unsealed. Atlantic Energy, a conglomerate built on decades of traditional fuel extraction, saw its margins flicker with panic. For some, Ariana's technology was salvation. For others, a threat to an entire business model. The case against her was clean on paper. Her patents were contested, contracts allegedly forged, and crucially, samples of code and a master design that, according to the prosecution's expert, could not have come from Ariana's lab before a certain date. That date, if true, proved she had misappropriated research and lied to investors and regulators. The press called her a fraud in totalizing headlines. The high-paid lawyers she had counted on were no-shows in court the morning the press sealed their narrative. In public, Ariana sat small, like some bright object under unbearable pressure. What the papers did not parse, because what happens in news cycles is often the simplification of human catastrophe, was the texture of coercion and the precise mechanics by which the evidence had been tampered with. That was the work Elliot wanted, not for the cameras, but for the woman at the table who, had he suspected, been deserted not by invention, but by industry interests. His first day in court was an exercise in slim margins. Judge Matthew Rourke listened, head cocked, as Elliot argued for a brief continuance to assemble evidence. He explained, plainly and without show, that the state of the record suggested not a simple theft, but an orchestration of appearance. He produced his bar card, the Janet that still hung in his jacket like a childhood memory. The judge allowed him to proceed on a tight timeline. It was a delicate permission, the kind of discretions judges make when the system must nudge itself toward fairness. Elliot's opening statements were short. He did not set out a sweeping legal theory. He told a story. Stories are, in a courtroom, dangerous. They are susceptible to flourish. His told of process, of timestamps, of people who could and would manipulate data when profits demanded it. He said he would be blunt. They would be shown that dates can be changed, metadata can be rewritten, and witnesses can be coached. When he sat, there were a few raised eyebrows. The prosecution smiled the practiced smile of someone who thought this was still theater. The first cross-examination was a light. Elliot asked an expert, Dr. Proyan Leonard Bryce, what timeline he had used to confirm when Ariana's code had been committed to a server. Bryce rattled off a chain of dates. Textbooks would have approved his diction. But Elliot, with a janitor's eye for detail and a lawyer's instinct for pressure points, asked a precise question. Doctor, did you examine the backup server logs from the research cluster in Brooklyn, or did you rely on the packaged evidence the prosecution provided? Bryce hesitated, just a breath. He had relied on the sealed packages. He had not seen the live logs. The prosecutor's jaw tensed, but the audience did not yet understand why that breath mattered. Elliot said nothing rhetorical. He simply requested records, server backups, administrative logs, chain of custody documents, and the judge, now more curious than skeptical, ordered an expedited subpoena. It was a small success, but victories in trials are rarely simple. They are a chain of small shifts. Outside the courthouse, cameras swung like predators. Ariana's face was clean and raw. She had an almost fierce weariness, like someone who'd been made to look smaller by accusation. Elliot walked with her to a cramped press corridor where microphones were pushed forward like inquisitorial fingers. She asked him quietly, "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me." He stopped, shook his head, and looked at the mop tucked into the crook of his arm like a badge. "Because someone left you at the table," he said. "Because that matters." Ariana's response was a thin, surprised smile. There was relief in it. There was fear, too, but she chose trust the way you choose a route when the map you had relied on falls apart. After court, the work began for real. Elliot had a daughter who was tenacious, more by necessity than temperament. Mia Warren had learned to move quietly around the edges of the adult world and to notice things adults missed. She had been 16 last summer when she began to teach herself basic coding to keep an ear on the internet's undercurrents. She could read a log line the way other kids read song lyrics. She had, over the months, become an analog detective with a digital skill set. Scraping file metadata, triangulating locations embedded in images, noticing when timelines didn't line up. Elliot called Mia that night with 2 words: "Court's mine." He kept his voice normal, because Mia responded better to normalcy than melodrama. She arrived with a backpack, 2 laptops, and a face that had learned to split indulgent affection from urgency. "Don't clean anything yet," she told him. "We might need the mop." They met at Ariana's brownstone as the city's dusk collapsed into the neon glaze of evening. The house smelled of strong coffee and machine polish. Ariana had been up for 20 hours building a timeline from memory and the few physical notebooks she had left, scribbles of algorithms and scrawls of dates. She led them through server rooms that looked from the outside like empty closets. Inside, racks hummed and lights blinked. The world as she had imagined it lived in racks and code more than in boardrooms and press releases. Mia set up a network partition and began to thread. She worked fast. Elliot watched, learning again the way a parent learns to be a student of their child's abilities. The pride that is wrapped in a quiet fear. Mia's fingers moved like statement lines, small and exact. She found anomalies. Files with timestamps that didn't fit their adjacent records. Backup sets that had been flushed and replaced on odd intervals. And user logins from an IP range that belonged not to Ariana's team, but to a shell company with a name that read like corporate camouflage: Aquila Holdings. Aquila had been a dormant LLC on paper until a tranche of funds moved through it 6 months prior, the day someone within Nexus had eliminated a technical argument about competition. Elliot's mind, trained on argument and motive, went to sequence. Motive means opportunity. He listens to the cold syllables Mia spoke, metadata, rollback, write times, and felt, like a man listening to a heartbeat in the dark, that there was life in the data history. Someone had rewritten the narrative to fit a different purpose. They mapped a chain that at the end led toward Gregory Vance. He was the kind of CEO whose public photos were exact and whose smile had reserved lines for the press. He'd built Nexus into an aggressive competitor by absorbing innovators and making them part of a strategy that left little room for genuine innovation that threatened energy markets. The more they dug, the more the chain of shell entities and intermediaries resembled a web, with Nexus's name through a handful of benign-looking transfers. Julia Fenwick was the link in the chain they had hoped wouldn't exist. Ariana had protected Julia in earlier news cycles as COO, a bright strategic mind who had once been one of Ariana's first hires. But corporate dynamics are merciless. Julia's position forced choices where loyalty and survival are not the same thing. There is a moment in conspiracies that looks like a choice, but is often framed by pressure. Elliot always tried to imagine that pressure as a physical force, something that could be measured by the way shoulders slumped in a room where a decision had been taken under threat. When Mia found Julia's past transfers, payments routed through Aquila and then dispersed to accounts lacking clear business purpose, the pattern fit too neatly to be an accident. Money flowed where timelines didn't. Julia agreed to meet them on a night when rain had flattened the city into silver. She chose the diner, a place with vinyl booths and indifferent lighting. Her face had the tired look of someone who had spent months negotiating with people who wore the same calm as predators. She slid into the booth, eyes rimmed with a kind of sleeplessness that looked like remorse. "I'm sorry," she said before they could ask. The words were thin but earnest. "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could keep you safe." Ariana's hand found the table, fingers splayed as if she might anchor herself to the present. Elliot watched Julia closely. It was impossible to paint her as a simple villain. She had reasons: blackmail, the threat of losing everything, fear for her children's future. Elliot knew how fear rewires decisions. A man who had lost Sarah understood how pressure could be misread as leverage. Julia slid a small phone across the table like a confession. It vibrated with notifications that felt obscene in the quiet. "It's his," she whispered. "I have messages. I heard him. Gregory says—" Her voice caught. She looked at Ariana. "He told me to make the record look like it happened later. He said it was policy. He said if we didn't, they'd cut us out and ruin us." Elliot put his hand on the phone as if to claim it. It felt like a hot coal, full of danger and possibility at once. Mia took it, hand steady, and began to scroll. The messages confirmed a pattern. Instructions at odd hours, a voice that matched Gregory Vance's public inflections, and one line that read, in cold text, "Make it appear as if the commit occurred post-date. We cannot have this leak." The phone was a window. It contained a series of audio files, voicemails, clipped and hurried. There was no melodrama in the recordings, only businesslike commands and an indifference that sounded, to Elliot's ears, worse than aggression. The content tied Vance to direct communication about manipulating evidence timing. It was not, on its own, a full exoneration of Ariana, but it was damning in a way prosecutions rarely are in public. Clear motive, explicit instruction, and the shadow of a cover-up that required coordination. Julia's hands were trembling. "I thought I was saving people," she said. "I thought I could protect the company, protect my family." Her eyes flicked to Elliot. "I can't live with it anymore." "You did the right thing coming forward," Elliot said, and it sounded less like consolation and more like command. They left the diner in a cluster of rain that blurred headlights into smeared sentences. The phone, copied and backed up by Mia in 3 separate encrypted partitions, pulsed with the hush of evidence that might, with care, change the arc of the case. Elliot tucked a replica in his coat, a proof that would survive if the original vanished. Protocol was a lawyer's instinct and a janitor's habit. When something mattered, you made sure there was a way to find it again. For a few hours, the world felt like it had pivoted toward justice. They had the phone, they had a confession, they had patterns linking shell corporations to Nexus. The moral arc seemed to bend toward accountability. But dark stories never end when someone says the right thing. They end in conflict. On the drive back to Ariana's brownstone, Mia kept her headphones on, a half smile like a kid who had solved a puzzle. Elliot watched the city go by, its motion merciless and indifferent. He felt, with an odd clarity, the shape of a new life forming in his mind. If they could prove coordination between Nexus and the manipulation of server logs, they could create reasonable doubt about the timeline the prosecution relied on. If they could show that Dr. Bryce's testimony came from packaged evidence rather than raw logs, they could demand a full audit. It would be painstaking, it would be messy, it would be worth it. They were not naive. Conspiracies operate on many levels. Evidence can be misplaced, phones can vanish, witnesses can be startled into silence. They had the phone, an incendiary device when wielded correctly. They had filmed confessions. But already the world around them gave small signals that presence had noticed movement. The first sign was a van that followed Ariana's black car for 3 blocks. It was late, and the rain folded like a curtain. Elliot watched it in his rearview mirror. The van's windows were too dark, and its driver had the look of men used to doing things nobody admired. He recognized in that stare the calibration of people who move under orders. He did not panic. Panic belongs to those untrained for threat sequences. He called Agent Blake Hollister, an FBI contact he had once made through the bar during a different case. Hollister's voice was calm. He told Elliot to keep the phone where it was, to get to a public place. "Don't upload it anywhere until my team is en route," the agent said. "If it's what you say, don't be surprised if someone wants it badly." They made it to the brownstone. Ariana moved through her home with a tentative, protective slowness. A security system hummed, and Maddox, her head of security, paced like a caged animal on alert. He was not the menacing type. He had the quiet competence of someone who existed to anticipate threats and shut doors. Still, there was a new tension in his movements. At dusk, a car skidded off the avenue 2 blocks away and slammed into an ancient lamp post. No explosions, no cinematic fireworks, just glass and the smell of burned rubber and men in dark coats who did not get out to check their tires, but instead scanned and left. On the news at midnight, the story was buried behind weather. To Elliot, it felt like a line in a script that escalated in small, deliberate acts. Danger can announce itself in mundane ways. Mia slept fitfully on a couch that night, laptop open despite the hour, a legal pad full of chain of custody notes beside her. Elliot watched her and felt a fierce, quiet gratitude for the child who had become a partner in something larger than school. He remembered Sarah's calm laugh and the way she used to say, "We will muddle through." It was a phrase that smelled like cheap coffee and more love than he had any right to expect. The next morning's email contained a short note. It was from an address that read benign, corporate-sounding, Aquila Holdings. Someone had accessed Julia's accounts and posted a note that looked like a legal demand: return the phone or face charges for stealing corporate property. It was a legal threat disguised as a tool of intimidation. Elliot emailed back, "We have copies. We will cooperate." He did not say what he knew, that he knew how thin the legal confidence behind the threat was. He also did not say that he had felt, like a thread pulled taut, that they were moving into a territory where intimidation could escalate into force. At the courthouse, the next hearing was scheduled to review the subpoenaed logs. Elliot had prepared. He sat with Ariana at the defense table, a triangle of purpose and exhaustion. The press circled like migratory birds. Prosecutor Morris had sharpened her tone. Dr. Bryce sat with a look of professional composure that yet betrayed something else, unease, perhaps, or worry that he would not be able to answer the new questions Elliot had refined overnight. Elliot began with something simple and devastating. A chain of custody list that showed an accession number and a sealed package had passed through an out-of-state courier at a time when the primary server showed live changes in its records. He contrasted the sealed package chain with the actual live backups that Mia had managed to obtain through a subpoena that insisted on an auditor opening protected partitions. The discrepancy was not, in itself, dispositive, but it was enough to make a prosecutor's confident script wobble. He called for a preservation order, an instrument that demands the maintenance of existing evidence while review is ongoing. Judges grant those requests often when there is a risk of tampering. Judge Rourke granted it with a strict tone that communicated the court's impatience with games. For the press, it was a headline, "Judge orders evidence preserved." For them, it was a small fortress built of paperwork. In the days that followed, the pressure vector altered. They had a phone and a confession, but they also began to feel the professional backlash. An article appeared in a legal trade paper suggesting Elliot was out of his depth, a once promising lawyer reduced to sensationalism for clicks. The firm that had walked away from him years ago published a statement about due process and the sanctity of expertise. Elliot read it while standing in the master's closet of a cheap hotel he'd stayed in during trial weeks, and for the first time in a long time he rehearsed a truth: that dignity doesn't derive from an expense account. Mia countered the press with a stronger line of work. She had mapped a network of IP addresses and corporate registrations that led from Aquila to a shell in the Caymans, and then, via a thinly veiled fiduciary, back into Nexus-controlled accounts. Each jump had a timestamp and a digital breadcrumb, a slip of code, a transfer log, an administrative confirmation. The web was not clean, but it was consistent. Julia met with them again. In a quiet hallway outside an evidence review, she pressed another envelope into Elliot's hand, this one holding printouts of email threads that showed a higher-level legal team discussing strategies to frame a narrative that would undermine the inventor's timeline. The language was surgical, the moral content was raw. Julia's face was pale. "I didn't know how far they'd go," she said. "I thought, if we could control the story, we could protect jobs, we could stop the loss." There was a pleading that had only sorrow behind it. "They're ruthless, Elliot." The revelations mounted like weather fronts. They were small things and large. An affidavit signed by a second-hand expert carried in a car by an associate who had business ties to a Nexus subsidiary. Invoices for consultancy that listed fake names and ghost hours. Backup tapes that had been rotated out the night something crucial was changed. They had chronology, but chronology had gaps that only a relentless combing could fill. The more they found, the more they realized how careful their enemies would be. There were no cinematic villains with mustaches twirling in layers. There were men and women who dressed carefully, who ran spreadsheet meetings, who made coercion feel like policy. Gregory Vance conducted his empire with a boardroom's efficiency and a strategist's detachment. If evidence could be shifted, if a court could be persuaded that the commit occurred after a certain date, then regulatory and criminal consequences would be diffused. He represented a Goliath of the modern age, not a monster, but an institutional will that had been taught to absorb threats. They also had limits. The law requires chain of custody. The law respects procedure. Elliot, ecclesiastically faithful to the craft he'd abandoned, knew that to win they must operate within the system's standards. A sloppily acquired confession could be excluded from evidence. An improperly copied phone could be attacked on grounds of authenticity. So they built redundancy, multiple copies, verified by independent auditors, witnesses willing to testify in open court, legal motions that would be impossible to deflect with public relations. It worked, for a while. Then an envelope arrived at Ariana's firm with a single sentence and nothing else: "Stop digging." There were no threats. There was no tone of boorish menace. It was the kind of text meant to be interpreted by the receiver as if a watchful hand had closed around a throat. Elliot's first instinct, call Hollister, was met with a promise of protection that read like an acknowledgement of vulnerability. The FBI could not be everywhere at once. They could, however, move when faced with a clear and present danger. The danger they had not foreseen was the scale at which a corporation could decide to protect its interests. Warnings snowballed into small acts. Someone tampered with Ariana's car brakes in a way that looked accidental. A van circled the block. A man's voice whispered from a payphone in a call that lasted less than 30 seconds before cutting. Each act was a notch in a psychological campaign. Elliot felt it as pressure in the silence, a kind of acoustic threat that made his jaw tension tight. That night, as they sat reviewing a cache of server rights, a text arrived in Mia's phone. It was a short sentence attached to the image of a highway camera. A white SUV, late model, photographed as it rolled past a plaza. They had been followed on multiple occasions. The text read, "You have something we need. Bring it back and you might get out clean." There was no sender. The text had a certain corporate economy to it, efficient and terrifying. They called Hollister.
He said a squad would be nearby, but that until they had more, they should maintain open spaces, public transit, crowds. If things escalate, he said, leave the evidence with someone you trust. Elliot looked at the copy of the phone's data sitting on the table. It felt heavier than its weight.
He had a mop in his hand in court and in his past. Now, the mop felt like a talisman, as if ordinary objects could anchor him to something human. He thought of Sarah and the way she used to tie up the wound of their life with small, everyday kindnesses. He thought of Mia, asleep on the couch earlier, and of Ariana, whose future flickered like a candle in an unseen wind. At 2 a.m, there was a knock at the brownstone's side door, so strategic and quiet they might have missed it if they hadn't been watching the cameras in the study. Ariana's security opened with a code. A man in a suit stepped into the foyer and asked for Julia Fenwick. Elliot stood in the hallway, the mop-scarred fingers of his past and the credentials of his present knotted together. For a moment, the man looked at him, puzzled perhaps by how an ordinary man could be in such a protected space. The man left with a soft smile that did not reach his eyes. He had, Elliot thought, the practiced kindness of someone whose job was to take things while making the act feel ordinary. They began to understand then the stakes had shifted from the courtroom to survival. If a corporation's protective instincts could include intimidation, then violence was a plausible next step. Elliot steeled himself. He had fought in courtrooms where the rules were clear. He had not fought in alleys or parking lots. But law was more than procedure. Law was rooted in a conviction that the truth mattered enough to be pursued. On the early morning after the visitor, Mia woke to a text that would change everything. An audio clip from Julia's phone with a file name that Mia did not recognize, but whose waveform suggested human speech. She played it, headphones low, and listened to a voice that sounded like Gregory Vance's, speaking over a small, hurried line. The voice gave orders: change timestamps, insert a narrative about a late commit, make it look like the inventor's claim post-dates a certain meeting. It was a boss's monotone, everything wrapped in professional detachment. When the clip finished, the room felt colder. "We need to move the evidence now," Elliot said. They planned methodically. Mia would courier the forensic copy to a neutral third-party auditor across state lines. Elliot would sit with Ariana and file motions to compel Nexus to produce raw logs. Julia would provide testimony and the original phone under an agreement with federal authorities. They had a window, a chain of custody they could make unbreakable if they could get both the physical phone and the forensic images into safe hands. They left the brownstone in a gray, uninterested dawn. The city was moving around them in mechanical routines. Maddox drove a security SUV with a driver who had a face like a man trained to read risk as if it were Braille. As they exited the avenue, another car pulled up alongside them. It tried to force them off the road, a classic intimidation maneuver. Elliot's instinct was to take evasive action, but Maddox had the steering of someone who had practiced for this eventuality. He slammed the vehicle into a side street, tires squealing, and lost the tail. They didn't know then whether the driver had been a random thug or a professional. The lines blurred in the hours after. Elliot filed emergency motions. Hollister's team promised wheels, but the message had been sent. Back inside the brownstone, as they breathed in and out, small and loud, the phone, Julia's phone, sat like an object of will on the kitchen table. It hummed with notifications. Mia had already begun the first leg of the copy. She worked with the sort of concentration that makes a room forget it is a room. Elliot watched her, and with each keystroke he heard an echo. The mop handle was under his thumb like a memory. He thought of court and how it rewards those who can make a technical point elegantly and those who can make moral clarity felt. In that moment, the moral clarity was simple.
A woman abandoned by muscle and money had a right to a fair day. A man's promise in a courtroom had to be more than a headline. It had to be work, slow, relentless, messy work. The mop was not a joke. It was a record of hours spent, of water wiped up, and of doors opened for people who did not notice. They had evidence. They had motive tied to a name. They had a whistleblower. They had a strategy. They had an enemy who could act with a corporate cruelty that made their stomachs clap with cold. There was one last thing to do. They moved the phone into a safe deposit at a bank 2 blocks from a courthouse. Mia, holding the bag with the device, looked over her shoulder as if the city itself might betray them. The bank's clerk fingered the deposit slip with bureaucratic indifference and locked the item into a steel box that had been built long before modern threats. It felt inadequate and necessary in the same breath. On their way back, a black SUV pulled across their path a half block from the bank. Its doors opened, and men in black, faces obscured, began to tail the deposit box courier who had followed them from the bank. Elliot understood, with a clarity that pressed at his chest, that the phone had become a target. As they drove away, he said to Ariana, "They think they can steal the story back." She looked at him as if weighing him for the value of the promise he'd made. "What are we going to do?" she asked. He met her eyes and felt the gravity of a man who had held a mop and had learned to stand up in a courtroom. "We keep going," he said. "We don't let them make us quiet." A siren sang far off. The city kept its rhythm. The mop in his memory had been an object that signified low status. He chose to make it into a symbol of persistence. They had choices left to them and ways to build fragile fortresses of paper and procedure. But the world had shifted.
The quiet of the morning had cracked open to reveal a web whose edges were jagged with intent. When Mia later opened the bank receipt, scrolling through the encrypted copies on her screen, she found an anomaly, a timestamp off by exactly 4 minutes from the bank's CCTV log. It was subtle, like a whisper, but in that small misalignment was the scent of someone altering timelines to suit a narrative. It matched a line in Julia's messages that read, "Time it to public events so it looks consistent." It was evidence of method. They had method too, but method required sacrifice. To use the phone as leverage would mean exposing Julia publicly. It would mean risking her future and her family. To hide it would mean losing the strongest thread they had. This was the repeated moral calculus of such battles, a scale with lives on both sides. Elliot sat alone in the brownstone small study after they had secured the copies and made their calls. The city hummed through the walls. He opened the old box where Sarah's photograph lay and touched the back of the frame. He whispered nothing in particular. The mop leaned in the corner, a wooden sentinel. There was a knock at the door. He didn't move at first. The rhythm of the knock felt off, too respectful for someone who wanted to be let in. Maddox's voice came from the hall, low. "It's for you." Elliot took a breath and opened the door. A delivery envelope lay there with a single line printed on the outside. "I know what you have. Do you?" The envelope was empty, except for a card that had one word, "Watch." He closed the door, and for a moment the world was sound, then silence. The mop in the corner seemed suddenly too light, as if the weight of what it symbolized was greater than its grain. He thought of the phrase Sarah had loved to say, their own private incantation when things were hard. "We will muddle through." He kept his face neutral and sat at the kitchen table where Mia and Ariana had laid out the maps. Mia caught his eye. She gave the faintest shake of her head and a small, determined smile that carried all the answers he needed. They would move the copies out again, to another auditor in yet another chain. They would file emergency motions and call Agent Hollister to get the Bureau to place protective watch. They would do the slow, meticulous work that made courtrooms into instruments of fairness. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rotation. Inside, the three of them bent over screens and printouts like people translating a map while the ink dried. They had a way forward. They moved in small increments after that night, like people shifting furniture in a room too full of memories. Copies went to two auditors, one a boutique forensic firm in New Jersey, another a university lab with a reputation for rigid methodology. Mia rode the chain of custody like a hawk, every transfer logged in triplicate, every checksum verified, until tiredness blurred numbers into a steady hum. Elliot drafted motions and called judges and did the work of a man who had remembered how the law could be shielded as much as wielded. Ariana sat at the table across from him and watched, her hands folded around a mug that steamed in the dim study light. The steam was a small human thing in a world that had already tried to make her into a headline. They built redundancy because they understood how fragile truth can be when someone powerful decides to break it. They also built a schedule, court dates, depositions, witness protection for Julia, because law, at its best, is a machine that depends on gears moving in the right time. The machine creaked occasionally. The press pounced on anything they offered that could be made sensational. But the momentum held. The phone's audio files were authenticated by the independent auditor. Voice prints matched to Gregory Vance's public statements beyond a reasonable doubt. The server logs Mia had wrested from a backed-up partition showed rollback events that matched timestamps on Julia's messages. Commits flagged, writes replaced, a sequence of edits that could not be explained by benign maintenance. Gregory Vance's name was stitched into the pattern with signatures of people whose careers sat in the crossfire. The first real break came in a deposition room a week before the next hearing. Dr. Bryce had been confident in his sealed package, the kind of expert who builds stature on the assumption that corporate evidence is what it is. Elliot watched him as the defense's auditor, the dry, efficient woman from New Jersey, displayed a live audit. Raw log lines, server events with IP origins, and an administrative trace that led to an account registered to a Nexus subsidiary. Bryce tried to explain again that packaged evidence was standard, that his methodology had been peer-reviewed, that he had relied on the documents the prosecution produced. The auditor's voice was blunt. "Doctor, were you given the live logs to review, or did the prosecution provide only summaries and a sealed package?" Bryce's eyes narrowed. He had rehearsed his talk. He had not expected a forensic expert to parse the assumptions underpinning his timeline. The tenor of the room changed. The prosecutor's face, Catherine Morris, did not change. Her jaw simply took on a more human line. What she had been given by the prosecution had long been accepted as foundation evidence. Now that foundation was being shaken by technical truth. Outside the courthouse, microphones found them as they walked to their cars. Ariana answered questions with the exact bluntness that comes from a person who has already been pressed into shapes by the press. "We asked for transparency," she said. "We did everything we were supposed to do." Her voice was even, but the cameras cut faster than her breath could steady. That night, Maddox called to report a suspicious van parked 2 blocks away from Ariana's brownstone again. Elliot and Mia's stomachs emptied the same way before a verdict. The city made its noises, and the risk felt like a pressure in the bones. They lodged a security escalation with Hollister. The FBI moved to increase surveillance. At the same time, a legal maneuver landed. A judge granted an evidentiary hearing to determine whether a forensic audit could be entered into evidence under the court's rules. A small, crucial permission that would allow the logs and the phone to speak formally in the case. They prepared for that hearing the way a battalion prepares for a storm. They rehearsed testimony, cross-checked dates, and practiced the best ways to explain technical things so laypeople, jurors, judges, cameras, could hear the moral import beneath a screen of metadata. Elliot wrote notes that translated server speak into story speak. Mia made cheat sheets that turned hexadecimal timestamps into plain timelines. Ariana sat with them and told small clarifying anecdotes. Where she had been the day a code snippet was written,
Who sat with her in the lab when they first solved a stability issue? What the research team's rituals looked like. Those details humanize the abstract facts. Judges and juries respond to people. Evidence without a human bar is often just a ledger. Julia agreed to testify in a secure room with a federal agent present. She practiced telling the truth in short sentences. It is shocking the way confession sounds when it is stripped of the defenses people build. Precise, breathy, and small. She would tell what she could and what she had done. She would give up the phone, and she would listen to the world that would inevitably judge her. Elliot knew he could not promise she would be spared consequences. He could only promise the truth would be used to try to repair what had been broken. Then the escalation they had feared moved from background menace to frontal assault. On a rain-thick Thursday, Ariana's security cameras registered 2 men climbing a service wall and cutting power feeds at precisely the points that disabled perimeter sensors. It was civilized in the way planned violence tends to be. Clinical, focused, neat. The estate lost light, and then, a minute later, the internet. Maddox rushed through the corridors like an animal pacing a cage. He double-checked the panic room procedure, air filtration, phone backup, the steel door with its 2 internal latches. Ariana had insisted to Elliot weeks earlier on keeping the panic room because of a childhood fear. She had never expected to use it. They moved fast, but practiced muscle memory is not the same as being calm. The panic room slammed shut with a metallic finality that made the air feel thick. Elliot hated how small and absurd the panic room felt. A square of reinforced walls, a bank of monitors, a table, and a single chair that had once belonged to a manufacturer of panic solutions.
The monitors flicked to life, showing the estate's outer grounds in grain, and then in thermal, and then in the jarring clarity of night vision as 2 headlights cut toward the gate. Maddox fed them security logs and whispered orders. Ariana's breath made the only obvious sound. Mia's hands shook when she dialed Hollister's secure line. Outside the panic room, men with the trained calm of mercenaries moved like choreographed notes. They wore black, faces masked, and their approach had the vocabulary of people who had been paid enough to carry out bad things without asking questions. They were not clumsy, they were efficient. They found the back entrance, then the terrace, and they moved through the property with the silence of premeditation. Cameras caught silhouettes, unremarkable perhaps, in the way a wave covers a beach. But to the small team in the panic room, the images felt like the unpeeling of a trap. Maddox refused to let them get further than the gate. He engaged with them at a terrace door, body and force against force. He was brilliant in the sort of way a guard becomes when he imagines the lives behind the doors as counts. A blow was exchanged, a muffled shout. The monitors showed a small group of men with tactical gear. There were explosive charges shown as small bright dots on thermal feeds, devices meant to force entry or terrify. One of the mercenaries moved to pry a lock and then stopped when a hatch point lit up and the house's internal silencers triggered an alarm sequence that made the men freeze in confusion. Inside the panic room, the tenor switched from fear to a precise calm that reads like collective training. Elliot tried to be the man he had been in court, calm, diligent, moral. He felt ridiculous in a room fortified for celebrities, but making him ridiculous did not change the threat. Mia pressed her back to the wall, laptop open, showing the encrypted copy of the phone. She tied live backup to a cloud not accessible through the estate's cut lines, an out-of-band route that Hollister had helped set up. The device hummed a small, steady reassurance, a proof that even if the house fell, data might live. On the monitors, they watched as the attackers found a way to a side entry. One man carried a battering ram. Another had a tablet showing a blueprint of the house, which meant this was planned. A mercenary spoke into a radio, and in the panic room audio they heard a voice. It was scrambled and brief. The men were professionals. The stakes were their lives. "Don't move," Hollister's voice ordered through a secure feed. "Stay in place. Keep the phone back to us. We have units en route. Federal tactical teams are moving in." Elliot watched the men on the monitors and felt the old lawyer's calculation crack into something else. A primitive protective force that was not legal theory but human scale. He imagined a mop in his hands again, and the memory steadied him. He thought of Sarah, of a small, stubborn life that persisted despite things falling apart. The mop had been a thing that cleaned what others threw away. It became in his mind a promise of unglamorous, persistent work. The first explosive charge went off outside, an angry, contained pop that shattered a camera housing and scattered irrigation pipes. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to destabilize the house's systems, to buy a 3-minute window during which forced entry could happen. Maddox cursed, his throat worked as he tried to hold back loudness. The blow against the battery of the panic room's door barely registered in the monitors as a metallic knuckle, but it felt enormous in the room. The men moved with intent. Mia found, amid her codes and checks, a vulnerability in the mercenaries' comms. She amplified one feed and then ran a sound through a speaker outside the panic room that impersonated the estate's own security chatter. An old trick she had learned from a forum where white-hat security people traded countermeasures. The attackers, sophisticated but not infallible, paused, listening to what they thought was internal miscommunication. That pause cost them momentum. It bought Hollister another 2 minutes. Someone on the outside, an unknown voice through the radio, heard a distinct call and responded, an order that redirected a team that had been poised at a second gate. It was a small clue that someone on the inside of their enemy ring had miscalculated. The pause amplified hope, and hope matters when all else narrows. They could hear footsteps circling the structure. A mercenary tried to breach a secondary door. It held. Time stretched thin. The panic room monitors ticked down a battery life. The room would remain operational for a while, but not forever if the power grid didn't come back. Items were moved, a chair into a window view, a laptop tethered to Mia's shoulder, the phone placed on the table like a relic. Then the estate's outer camera went dark, as if someone had plucked a cord. For a moment, the monitors were just a black screen. The quiet that followed was thick and close. Elliot could feel everyone counting heartbeats. And then, like a sudden correction, a different sound cut through. The distant staccato of tires hitting wet pavement and the disciplined voices of law enforcement. Red and blue light bled across the panic room's vents. On one monitor, a SWAT van rolled up. On another, silhouette figures formed. Hollister's voice came through, steadier than it had a moment before. "Hold tight. We're in position. Don't make a move until we tell you." Outside, officers in ballistic vests moved with the slow intensity of people trained to do only one thing at a time. They breached the perimeter on the side where Maddox had redirected the mercenaries' attention. Flashbangs exploded with a noise that was enormous but not obscene, designed to disorient, not to maim. In the perimeter windows, small figures moved. The mercenaries broke formation and attempted to flee. One of them, in the flurry, was taken down by a targeted strike. Others were cuffed under yells. A man attempted to run with a device strapped to his belt. An officer called out, and the man froze, then dropped to his knees when he realized escape was impossible. Inside the panic room, the adrenaline that had been a drumroll of fear found a relief valve. Maddox walked through the door made by the SWAT team, face dirty, eyes wide, jaw set like a man who had been ready to die and hadn't. He slumped against a wall and exhaled the kind of breath a person lets when they remember their limbs. The FBI collected men with recorded voices, radios, and comms logs. One of the seized tablets contained coordinates and times that matched surveillance footage the team had. In the back of the melee, an officer in a suit, Hollister, moved with the authority of a man who had brought the force to the right place at the right time. The arrests at the estate were the first dominoes. The phone and the server copies, safe in encrypted partitions the FBI had confirmed, were now official evidence. Fast-moving warrants went up against Nexus. Hollister's team presented the same forensic evidence to a judge who authorized simultaneous raids on Nexus's offices and on a townhouse where Gregory Vance stayed during the week. It is rare that tactical and legal wheels align so tightly, but when they do, the effect is decisive. At Nexus, the FBI arrived early the next day. They had probable cause, they had warrants, and they had the phone's forensic duplicates authenticated by an independent lab. Vance was taken in his penthouse office, stunned in a moment when his world had still seemed made of impenetrable protocols. The handcuffs were clinical, and his eyes registered the change before his mouth found a statement. "You're making a mistake," he said 3 times with increasing incredulity. Then the agents led him down the stairs past stunned staff. The public statement came later. Nexus had been cooperating with a federal inquiry. The immediate, visible effect was the arrest. In the weeks that followed, another set of legal events cascaded. Julia Fenwick provided a measured, painful testimony before a grand jury. Her voice, once practiced in corporate conference rooms, now spoke with a different cadence, full of regret and of a desire to correct a mistake that had felt like survival at the time. Her account percolated into court filings. The forensic audits laid bare the administration account that had made timestamp alterations and traced that account back through Nexus's internal registry. There were emails, dry, efficient communications that tied a nexus of people to an intent to manipulate narrative. The public could watch the court filings unfold like a slow-motion reveal. On the day their evidentiary hearing moved into trial territory, the courtroom filled in the way it had the first day, only now there was a different tension in the air. Reporters lined the back, cameras angled for reaction shots. Elliot, his mop memory tucked into the corner of his head like a talisman, sat at the defense table with Ariana to his right and Mia to his left. The auditors were sworn in. A federal agent supplied chain of custody records that explained, in terms the court could accept, how the phone was preserved and how logs had been copied and verified. Elliot's cross of Dr. Bryce was surgical. He took the expert's veneer of certainty and drilled into its basis. "Doctor," Elliot asked, "did you rely on a server image provided to you in sealed form, or did you examine the cluster's live backups?" Bryce answered, "I relied on the materials provided by the prosecution." "And did you independently authenticate the administrative logs?" Elliot pressed. The exchange made Bryce fidget. He could not conjure a different answer. The auditor who had prepared the live logs was called to the stand and walked the court through how administrative actions had been traced to a Nexus subsidiary, how rollback events were logged with admin keys, and how the timestamp anomalies could only be explained by deliberate edits. Mia's diagrams, simple, precise timelines showing commits and edits, came up on court screens. The jury watched numbers become narrative. Then, the moment the press would later call the courtroom's pivot arrived not with drama, but with a technical clip played in open court. Julia's voicemail to a Nexus legal lieutenant instructing edits to a commit, followed by a fragment of Gregory Vance's voice giving orders about adjusting the narrative so the invention appeared after the meeting. The audio, authenticated and clear, had an effect that could not be faked by rhetoric alone. It was audio, and it was the kind of thing that sits like a knot in the throat of legal machinations. Prosecutor Catherine Morris stood when she realized the arc of her case was compromised. She had to reconcile the truth with the consequences of it. She had built a case on timelines, and yet the timelines were now undercut by authenticated administrative traces and chain of custody evidence. In a moment of judicial honesty that was not theatrical, only practical, Catherine rose and said quietly, "Your Honor, given the new evidence and these demonstrated manipulations, the prosecution cannot in good faith continue to prosecute on the present record." Judge Matthew Rourke listened. He had seen many things in his career, well-meaning missteps and careful manipulations. He had a reputation for patience balanced by a cool sense of justice. He looked at Elliot, then at Ariana, and then at Catherine. He did what a fair court does when it sees that prosecutions rest on tainted foundations. He called for a conference. The result was not a theatrical exoneration. It was money with a purpose, something Ariana insisted on being structured so that it could neither be co-opted nor hidden behind corporate layers.
Elliot and Mia took a smaller but no less radical step. They hung a placard over a narrow office in Brooklyn. It read, in modest type, "Warren and Warren, pro bono and public interest." It was not the old firm with leather chairs and partnership tracks. It was built from a different idea, that law had to be available to those who could not buy it. The idea drew donations from unexpected quarters, small investors who admired Ariana's gesture, local bar associations who wanted to rebuild trust, and clients whose cases had nothing to do with glamour and everything to do with human need. The office was a shabby joy at first, chipped paint, a kettle that whistled as if cheerful, and a photograph Elliot kept on the wall of Sarah and him at the promotion. The mop hung on a peg near the door, like a relic that refused to be sentimental beyond necessity. Mia enrolled in a pre-law program. She took to torts and constitutional outlines like a language she had half invented. The courtroom had been her classroom for months. She had watched procedure and mercy, evidence and its fragility. Elliot signed her enrollment forms with the kind of pride that was tempered by a knowledge that law could be both weapon and repair. He taught her the kind of humility his practice had forced upon him. The law is a tool, not an altar. Romance, in the way DNA had cautioned, did not explode into scenes. It seeped. Ariana and Elliot moved around each other with a new normal. They drank coffee in the Warren and Warren office on slow afternoons, not as public figures, but as two people who had seen each other at a time of rupture and had chosen to stand. They spoke of small things, Ariana's preference for bitter espresso, Elliot's inability to choose a new suit, Mia's jokes about their public personas. There were longer conversations, too, about grief, about the quiet ways people mend, about what it means to rebuild a public life after being dragged through mud. They held each other in the small, private ways of people who trust again. On a day that looked ordinary, a thin winter sun, a coffee shop window fogged with breath, Ariana reached across the table and touched Elliot's hand. It was not a cinematic embrace so much as an offer, the kind you make when you want to test the waters of a new life. He looked at her, at the scars at his knuckles, at the softness that sadness had given his face. He bent and kissed her by instinct rather than by plan, a gentle, respectful kiss that carried 100 small promises. The cameras did not make an appearance. They did not need to. It was a human moment. The Lockhart Legal Justice Fund opened with a modest ceremony attended by a handful of people who had mattered and a larger group that streamed the event.
Ariana spoke about responsibility and how the world needed institutions that could act without fear of being swallowed by capital. Elliot, standing beside her, spoke less, but when he did, his words had the cadence of someone who had learned to speak in ways the people in his life could understand. "Justice," he said into a microphone, "doesn't depend on the price of your suit." It was not a speech crafted for virality. It was a sentence that felt like a returned favor to the city and to the memory of his life before exile. Mia, in her first semester of law school, sat in the back of the ceremony with a notebook and a look that wavered between amusement and awe. She had done the hard work of translation, server logs into sequences, fear into action, and now she watched people put parts of her world into a structure that might outlast personalities. She had changed in ways she did not yet fully articulate. She smiled at her father, and his face, older and more certain than in parts of the past, brightened like a pilot light. There were, of course, costs. Julia received a sentence that included community service and a cooperation agreement. The court balanced punishment with the value of her testimony. She left the courtroom carrying both the shame and the quiet resilience of someone who had tried to make amends under the weight of survival. Greg Vance faced a trial that would take years and upend many careers. The corporate edifice that had tried to erase a truth now had to answer for its choices. Elliot's old firm did not call to offer the partnership they had once stripped him of. He did not expect it. The world had changed in ways that were painful and corrective. He swept the floors in their narrow office only on days when he needed literal motion to steady his mind. The mop stayed on its peg, worn, a reminder that dignity is not always a matter of display.
Months later, the final public note arrived in the form of a short paragraph printed in small newspapers and on online feeds. The charges against Ariana were formally dropped, accompanied by a settlement that included funding for independent audit panels for small tech startups. The headline was modest. The lives behind the headline were full of small differences: fewer sleepless nights, a new willingness to trust a guard, a daughter who wanted to apply to law schools, and an office that served people who could not afford big bills. On the day Warren and Warren finally put up its modest plaque, Elliot invited the people who had mattered: Mia, Ariana, Julia, Maddox, Hollister, the auditors who had done their technical work without fanfare. They curated a strange, small moment of victory in an otherwise complicated life. The office smelled of new paint and of the coffee Ariana insisted on sending in by the thermos. The plaque was hung crooked at first and then straightened by a volunteer who had more patience than the rest of them. Elliot spoke quietly. He did not ask for applause. Mia wrote her essays and applied to law schools with a file full of experience and a tone of purpose that made admissions counselors lean forward. On a late spring evening, when the city smelled of thawing earth and the bodega on the corner sold strawberries by the pound, Elliot and Ariana walked in the park with Mia between them. The three of them moved like a family grown out of trial, not perfect but honest, scarred in ways that taught tenderness. They stopped at a bench and sat. A child ran by with a kite. An old couple argued about directions with the familiar theatrics of people who have shared directions as a habit. Elliot looked at Ariana. He did not need a courtroom to tell him what he felt. He reached for her hand, and she took it. And it was the simplest, most public thing either had done in ages, a small, consistent touch. A headline writer somewhere would later condense the story into a single, unforgettable phrase: "I will defend her." The clip of the mop and the bar card, that image, replayed across streams and podcasts and water cooler conversations. People liked the shorthand: a man with a mop, a billionaire inventor, and improbable alliance. But the shorthand could not capture the weeks of waiting, the technical proofs, the moral calculus that had been paid for in sleepless nights. The shorthand could not hold the quiet moments when someone like Julia decided she had to tell the truth despite personal cost, or the days when Mia sat with her laptop until dawn because the chain of custody needed another verification. Elliot sometimes, in private, pulled the bar card from his wallet and smoothed its creases. He thought of Sarah, of how they had once dreamed of doing work that mattered. He thought of the mop that had been a banner in a moment of desperate need. He recorded none of these things for cameras. He needed them as a man needs the memory of small kindnesses to get through hard days. At the Lockhart Fund's inaugural symposium, Ariana stood before a crowd and said something simple that felt like the truth of their whole season. Courage doesn't require a suit. It requires a willing hand and the stubborn belief that truth matters. Elliot sat in the second row, not on stage, and watched as the people around him clapped. It was strange to be applauded for doing something you believed you had to do. He said nothing. He did not need to. When final paperwork closed the case against Ariana, when the city and country had digested the arc from accusation to exoneration to institutional change, Elliot walked out of the courthouse carrying a thermos Ariana had given him. He turned and looked at Mia, who had just been accepted into law school with a scholarship that would let her study without the weight his past had once carried. He felt a softness in his chest that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with family, found and chosen. They had not created a utopia.
Nexus would litigate. Settlements would be negotiated. Reputations would be repaired in some corners and remain scorched in others. People would continue to try to shape narratives to advantage. That, Elliot knew, would always be true. But he had seen how a small group of determined people, armed with honesty and verification and the stubbornness of ordinary courage, could blunt the edge of institutional power. On a quiet evening, as the city prepared for night, the trio sat on their modest stoop and watched a plane cross the sky. Mia leaned her head against Elliot's shoulder. Ariana, warm at his other side, traced a small pattern on his palm. He thought of the mop one last time, not as a joke or a gimmick, but as a symbol of work done under unhelpful circumstances, of dignity reclaimed. The world had given them a course no map promised. They had navigated it poorly at times and bravely at others. A headline in the months after would remember him for the phrase that had broken the first silence, "I will defend her." But the work that followed proved that promises in public require labor in private. Justice had arrived in increments: audits, subpoenas, a phone recorded and backed up, a tactical raid, courtroom clarity. Each piece of evidence, each honest testimony, each legal motion had mattered. If anyone asked what had changed in Elliot, the answer would be small. A man who had once measured his worth by what he earned had learned to measure it by what he would stand up to protect. It was not a heroic transformation engineered by fate. It was a slow, daily decision to keep going. And in the end, there was a quietness to the victory that made it feel real. Ariana's work continued. Mia studied with a kind of intensity that suggested this fight had not simply passed, it had enrolled her. Warren and Warren grew into a small practice that did not make headlines but changed lives. The Lockhart Fund financed independent audits for dozens of cases, and the idea of transparent, affordable forensic review became something less exotic and more possible. When the video finally closed for public consumption, the footage edited down for 1,000 feeds and replays, a line at the end invited the viewer to remember what had been at stake. The final frame lingered on a worn mop handle leaning against a modest office door, a bar card in a wallet, and a small plaque that read Warren and Warren. It was a visual shorthand for a story larger than one moment. An ordinary man choosing to defend a woman abandoned by her world, and in doing so, building scaffolding that allowed others to stand. If this story leaves you thinking that ordinary people can tilt mighty systems when they work together, then share it. If you believe justice is worth the small acts and the long waits, hit like, subscribe, and pass it to someone who needs a reminder that courage, integrity, and steady hands still matter.